Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we are diving into the sequel to the hit video game Hades with Hades 2, or at least how it is in early access. Bear in mind, Hades 2 right now is still only in early access as we're recording this, so much of the story is still in development, but we're going to also talk about the game as it stands now, as well as the 2020 game Hades. And since we're tackling a medium that is not totally in all of our wheelhouses, we've asked a veteran of the industry, gaming and history specialist, to come and help us out. So please give a warm welcome to Megan Sullivan, producer of History and Games, a video and audio series discussing the real stories hidden inside our favorite video games. Welcome, Meg. Glad to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really looking forward to this. And really, the expertise is actually, I think, much needed. But first, tell us about your experience with Hades, first game, the sequel as it is, or as it stands. How much have you played? And do you dig Hades 2?
Oh, I dig Hades and Hades 2 so much, so deep. I came to Hades in around, I want to say, just after early access, so somewhere between 2020, 2022. I can't quite remember, but I love the game. I love everything about it, the gameplay mechanics, the level design, the acting, the story, but especially the lore, right? They really did a great job at Supergiant Games researching the lore for Hades, and they did a great job with Hades 2 and the lore there, and they changed up some of the mechanics in interesting ways. So don't worry, I will gush all about this series. Big props to Supergiant Games for these amazing roguelike games.
Perfect. I'll pivot over actually to Christy, who has been live streaming Hades 2 a little bit in the last couple of weeks. But yeah, how are you liking it so far?
I am definitely enjoying it. I think I've also been doing discussions about the game on some of our social media platforms and kind of discussing, the frustrations with early access, but like how important it is to video game development and how Supergiant's doing a really good job of like, they're still making a really great story. And it's just hard because you want to be patient as the audience, but you can only take so much all at once. So it's a weird experience as a player or an audience of this franchise, as opposed to like waiting for an end result of an entire season or a movie or something like that. So it's kind of weird where the lore is still being built around something that it's already in action. At the same time, like, we don't get to talk about games often. Mm-hmm. And one thing I was really excited to talk to you, Meg, about was like how this actually prompts us to learn about mythology, like deep dive mythology in a lot of ways. But it's also promoting this, like, you learn through failure, which I think is actually something that's really important. A lot of us come from academic backgrounds where like failure is kind of a terrible thing to experience. It's not good. And so having a game that allows you to learn successfully through your failures is such a cool mechanic. So like, that's definitely something I want to talk more about too. So yeah, I love the series. I think it's awesome.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. I have a thought on that, but we'll put a pin in it just for a second because I want to pivot over to Eli. What are your thoughts? Has this convinced you to play video games yet?
I feel like so many things have tried to convince me to play video games, and I am like the big outsider in that I did not grow up playing video games, and I feel like there's such a huge learning curve now of like, how do I get into it? Like, how do I even access the game? How do I even do that? The only system in my house is a PS2, which Nick bought in COVID to play like familiar, happy games. So I have very, very little experience other than like some of the poking around that I've done watching playthroughs by myself, watching Christy and Andy. And I really, really love the art and the narrative of Hades as an outsider again coming in. It is so cool to see just like a very new, fresh, and fun way of looking at this kind of very I don't know, stuff that could be very academic or very old school or very boring if you're just reading it on paper, making it into something that's like super colorful and like neon and like fun and running around. And yeah. So sure, yeah, it's convinced me that I would love to do that. Perhaps if the learning curve was not so horrifically high.
Well, the game, this is, I would say, this game can be incredibly hard and punishing in many ways, but it's sort of forgiving in some ways. But before I guess we get into the discussion proper, just to give us somewhat of a plot summary for people who maybe haven't played it yet, just kind of let them know where the story is right now. So the game picks up some period of time after the events of the first game. We have a new protagonist, Melanoi, princess of the underworld, sister to Zagreus, our original Protagoras. Our original Pythagoras. Our original protagonist. Damn it, I did it again. Our original protagonist. There it is.
There you go.
I like Protagoras. I think that's a great name.
I do.
Too many Greek names, but just rolling off the tongue. But yeah, so Melanoi, aided by her mentor Hecate, she's trying to defeat Kronos, the Titan of Time, who has come back to enact his vengeance on gods and mortals. There's a lot of game and story and characters left, but there's a lot in there right now. The early access was pretty big compared, especially if you've played the early access for Hades 1. But I guess I think my question first is to get into the thing that Christy was talking about the thing I like most about these games is the way the mechanics and the structure of the game is woven into the story and the themes. Like, it's about dying again and again and again, repeating. In this game, there's a big theme, it seems like, with time and like repetition, and the way that it sort of blends all of these three strains, like, right, the mechanics of the game and the narrative and the sort of central themes. Let me ask first, even before I get to that, go back and cut that part out. How far of we? So I haven't actually started playing this game yet because I'm precious and I don't buy games until they're fully out. But how far? Because I know, Christy, you and Andy have gotten at least past the third boss. Meg, how far have you gotten so far?
I've gotten past 2 or 3 of the bosses, and I was looking up how to beat a couple other bosses. So I kind of cheated and looked on YouTube about like the structure of the narrative and what to do to get past these bosses, because I got really stuck at one point. And far enough to say that I'm really enjoying it, and that I just love the way that, like you said, the gameplay mechanics tie into the lore. I think that's something special that Supergiant Games does really, really well. But I don't want to spoil anything for anyone by being too specific about where I am, because half the fun is like meeting these characters and learning about them.
Yeah. Well, there was one character we kept running it. So Andy was the one playing for us while we were live streaming it. And my partner is a huge gamer, really good at roguelites and things like that. And he just kept doing really solid runs. Like, I think he got through the second boss. We kept getting basically stuck at Cerberus. So spoilers in that regard, you do run in Cerberus. And part of the problem is because you run into this character who nerfs you intentionally. And she's very sassy about it too. If you keep getting too far in the game without having died enough times. I guess Andy's doing a different play file too. You also end up playing her as a boss later on too, in a different location. So just introducing, okay, I will do this one spoiler. Eris, goddess of discord, famously threw the golden apple into a wedding that's basically sparked the entire Trojan War in mythology. She shows up to basically mess up your run, which is really fun. And I like those interactions, for instance. So that's a really smart game mechanic, where it's like, no, the goal is to fail. The goal is to die and start over. So you get more of the story. But even if you succeed, you still get like new dialogue and things that you wouldn't see necessarily if you weren't quite as skilled in those runs. So it's really cool that it gives you something, no matter your skill level, like it's going to pay off in the end, which I think is, again, something about learning that's really important.
Which was like, there's another theme with this one that's kind of like to differentiate this game a little bit from Hades 1, which, like, while they're very similar in kind of the broader structure and many of the designs, but like there's a big theme I'm sensing with this game of like tutelage and learning. Like Christy said, like, so like Melanoe, she's framed as like a student and her headmistress is Hecate. And so they have this like teacher student dynamic, head marm, protege. And that's reflected in like the way like Melanie, she seems a little more proper than Zagreus, for lack of a better word. She has that kind of like decorum, for lack of it. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, in the first boss, which is against Hecate, when you beat her, it says test passed instead of like enemy defeated, which I kind of like, right? That's an important aspect. So Meg, I know that you've actually done a conference presentation on Underworld and the gaming and how that's important for both developers, but can you also talk about why you think it could be good for learning as well?
There's something about tactile learning, like actually putting yourself in the shoes of a protagonist and making that experience more real. It gets more into your muscle memory, right? It's more enjoyable. It's more participatory as opposed to passive. And it's just really fun. And I think that Supergiant Games does such a good job with the lore. And for example, I don't want to get too far ahead of the discussion, but like, I love what you said about the teacher protege thing, like test pass. That's such a great observation. But also the idea of the relationship between Melanoe and Hecate, which we can get into sort of Melanoe is only in two sources in history, which is the Orphic hymns and the Pergamon tablets. And knowing the history of those gets people interested in like, oh, okay, like why is she more serious than Zagreus? Why is she so much angrier? And that really has to do with just also not just setting a different tone for a different game. It's really about the difference in their personalities and their purpose in the Orphic hymns. That Melanoe is an angry aspect of her mother, Persephone, whereas Zagreus and Dionysus and Hades and Zeus, they're all sort of interconnected as well. So they're coming at it from all these really cool perspectives of like teacher and protege, but also like a maternal figure and a daughter. I mean, there's so many wonderful layers to this, and experiencing that, I think, makes players interested in being like, I want to learn more about the Orphic hymns, or I want to learn more about ancient Greek history and mythology.
Yeah. And for listeners, like just a little background. So the Orphic hymns are this like alternative series of stories and myths and cosmologies and origin stories and things like that are attributed to Orpheus that he learned in the underworld and came back and shared with people. And they have these kind of alternate versions of creation. And there's a lot of that in the first game and this one as well. Like there's a whole kind of, I bring this up in some of my lectures about, there's a running joke in the first game about Dionysus and Zagreus conspiring to trick Orpheus into like, it's this reverse. It's a very, for lack of a better word, like Alexandrian, like it's a very ancient thing to do. Like I'm going to kind of reinvent the origin of this thing. But yeah, Orphism, the fact that Orphism is making its way into a like game of the year contender is a feat in and of itself, right? Like,
right?
Yeah, who had that on their bingo list?
No.
But
absolutely not.
Yeah, I remember playing through Hades first, and I was like, this is like a deep cut of like there's stuff here that like I barely am aware of after having studied material similar to it for decades. And I'm like, whoa, this is really cool. And I think what's really cool, because we see this with certain characters like Spartacus or something, right? Like there's just enough information out there to give you a name, a little bit, maybe some of their characteristics, but then it gives creators so much leeway to imagine their biography, imagine their story beyond that, and make a really cool story, because sometimes all you need is a little bit for that inspiration. And like Supergiant does an amazing job with it. It's really impressive.
I was really excited that there was like a girl protagonist this time around. Like Zagreus was really fun as like, I don't know, he's just like a goofy teenage kid almost, which was, I don't know. And maybe like that's, again, my perspective, and perhaps that's not 100%
my vibe
true.
is he's like prep school dropout is like the energy I get from Zagreus.
Sure. Okay. That does actually make a lot of sense. But he was still like a boy running around. And so it still felt very, I don't know, like masculine, which is fine in so many ways. But I was so excited to see like a very feminine turn into the same world. So we're doing a lot of the same, challenges, and we're having a lot of the same battles, but it's Melanoe and it's Hecate, and they have, the mother-daughter aspect to it. Meg, I like that you brought that in as well, because yes, if we're talking anything about Persephone, there's going to be like a familial mother-daughter baggage hanging in the background.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I love that the whole thing about that feminine energy, and that, what Hecate, her whole narrative arc throughout ancient Greek history, how she starts off as, scholars think she was an possibly Anatolian sun goddess or from Egypt, but then she goes in late antiquity, she's like Hecate the savior, right? Like this powerful, protective creator. And I love that Hecate, they're sort of getting rid of that stereotype, or trying to get rid of that stereotype of, well, Hecate is the goddess of witches and curses and magic. And it's really, she's a liminal goddess who's there to protect people through transitional periods. And I love that energy and how it's about female empowerment and sort of taking back that power and getting rid of that, witchy, scary stereotype.
Yeah. I also like her design because she's also in some iterations a tripartite goddess. And so on her shoulders, you see the two masks on her shoulders to emulate the three heads.
I thought you were talking about her washboard abs. But.
Yeah, her washboard abs. So
those are pretty nice too.
Yeah, I'm not going to complain about those.
Elijah, I like what you were saying about like the energy and motivations of our protagonists are like Zagreus is he just wants out from the underworld, right? Like he doesn't have a big overall goal. He just wants to get away from dad.
He does, but it's you, dad. That's his energy.
That's it, right? and for Melanoe, there we go. Sort of.
You got it.
She is been trained, and like she has this mantra shared with Hecate, which is death to Kronos, right? Like it's very driven and focused. And there's a point in the game, because eventually there's two different paths you can start to take. We had just touched on the possibility in our playthrough where she's like, oh, the Olympians need me. And she goes to Hecate, she's like, should I go help them? And she's like, and Hecate is saying, no, we need to, this is the goal. This is what our focus is. And I think that's kind of interesting, because my big question for the game right now is, what is Hecate's goal and motivation in training Melanoe and Nemesis to attack Kronos specifically? Because Hecate herself is also considered a Titan. So what we did for the first game with Orphic Hymns, we're really telling two different major stories here of you have the Titanomachy and the results of that, and that's a lot of the characters we see. But it's also interesting because it's being brought in with Odysseus and the Odyssey and Nostos of homecoming. And that's also Melanoe's goal, is going back home to a home she probably doesn't even remember.
Yeah.
Because she was removed from it as an infant. And I thought that pairing was so interesting.
And it's a reverse, right? Like in the first game, you start in Tartarus, you start in Hades' house, go up. In this one, you end in, well, not end, but one of the bosses, the like bottom floor, is the House of Hades. Like you're kind of, they are, I don't know, mirrors of one another, palimpsests, I don't know, something like that.
and they do play the idea of like, instead of like up or down, they do a really good job of mapping this as a liminal space, like moving in spaces that are different than we've seen before, but that do intersect with what we are familiar with. So like, when Andy beat Cerberus and all of a sudden we're like in Tartarus, I'm like, oh my God, I think this is Tartarus. I think we're like back in the underworld. And like, that was a really cool moment because you had been in such unfamiliar spaces, and then seeing something familiar is such a cool experience. So like, they're playing with spaces along with the characters in really cool ways.
And on that note, sort of a slight sort of pivot, but on the note of familiar, and this is really a question for Meg, of also just because like I haven't had the controller in my hands yet to play this, but I understand that it's like just similar enough to the first game that it's familiar, but like a lot has changed, or it's different enough that like you kind of have to relearn like how to walk or how to ride the bike or something like that. But I don't know, what's your experience been with like the way like the weapons and the boons and all that stuff, like how that shifting into this new game?
Right. So, in the first game, you had specific infernal arms, which were hilarious. They were like typical themes, like a shield
Mhm.
or a spear, but then
Gun.
you had like basically a grenade launcher, right? Like
Yep.
Yep.
Hessian's, like
Mhm.
adamant rail or whatever it's called, where you're just like, all right, I'm just gonna roll with this. And here, you have your own weapons for Melanoy. So the weapons are different, they work different. And it feels like there's a little bit more strategy in the way that Melanoy moves when it comes to like dashing or dodging. So you have
Mhm.
to be a little more strategic. And of course, it's everything she does is based on magic because Persephone and a few other goddesses are aspects of Hecate. And
Mhm.
so, you have a lot of magic infused in things. You have different types of currency and different ways of leveling up skills. So it's like it's enough so your muscle memory will be similar. If you've played Hades, you'll understand Hades too. But like the boons you get and everything are just a little bit different, and the people you get them from are a little bit different. So I'm going to break my own rule, and I'm like, if you're listening to this and you've already probably played the game, but like you'll meet different characters like Circe or Medea, and I love the way they handle Medea. It's really interesting. That's a tough character to handle, right? She does
Mhm.
not have a very good reputation, right? So the way they balance it and the boons that Melanoid gets from them, whether it's boosting certain stats or nerfing certain enemies or whatever, it's really different and it's really interesting. And of course, it all again ties into the lore and the entire gameplay loop. So
Yeah.
it's both fresh and familiar.
Mhm. But with a witchy aesthetic, which they've also like
A
leaned
very
hard into.
wonderfully witchy aesthetic, magic
Mhm.
everywhere. Gotta love
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that brings me back to another of Elijah's point. Like, what is fun about this game as a sequel is like we do have a female protagonist in a game. And I wanted to talk about that to speak more broadly because the other video game that we've talked about besides Hades is Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where you do have the option to have a male or female character. And originally it was supposed to be focused on the female character. And there's such a I mean, that's what's hard about the video game world is that there's misogyny everywhere, but it can be very
And
toxic.
it feels like it's got, maybe this is just my perception, but it feels like it has gotten worse in the last 5 to 10 years, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It has, and part of that has to do with, and this is a whole different, can of worms, but it has to do with influencers who are sort
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
grifting off people's anger and loneliness and be like, oh my gosh, this super cool female protagonist. Well, she's just there because she's DEI or she's woke. And I'm like, do you
Yeah.
even know what those words mean?
Yeah.
And also, like, you didn't complain about Samus, you didn't complain about Lara Croft, you didn't complain about all these other female characters, but it's just the trend right now, being like,
Mhm.
Mhm.
oh no, this character, in Ghost of Yote or Horizon, oh no, it's a female character. That's only because you're trying to be politically correct. Or it could be that the story just works with a female protagonist. It doesn't have to be the thing you think
Mhm.
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, even, Lara Croft, we covered the animated series that came out on Netflix not too long ago, and some of the major critiques of, like, this
Oh my god.
very athletic woman
Mhm.
is toned and muscular, and they actually make her look like that instead of polygonal boobs of the original
Yeah.
90s games, right? And
Right.
it's like, to me, she looks like such a realistic character. If, like, you're pulling off those kinds of physical feats, that is what you would physically look like. But then there's this cohort that are upset that, like, the body does not match, like, what they want a female
Sure.
protagonist to look like.
Yeah, they're complaining about Siri in The Witcher 4 right now. This was revealed
Oh
at the Game
yeah.
Awards
I've
No.
last
been,
week, who
yes.
is absolutely gorgeous, looks exactly like a gorgeous Hollywood star, and people are being like, "She's ugly," and I'm like, "In what
We
universe?"
can't.
Truly. Well, I mean,
No.
they tell on themselves in very obvious ways. My personal favorite is when they're like, there was some screenshot about in one of the Horizon games where you can see like the peach fuzz on Aloy's cheeks, and they're like, Aloy
Right.
has a beard, and you're just like, you tell me you've never met a woman without telling me you've never met a woman. Um,
Yeah.
but anyways,
Yeah, so well, can you speak a little bit of, like, as you've said, you've been working in the industry for a long time. Do you feel like these video games that do have the female protagonists that are telling real good stories through them, is that starting to make a difference, or is there still a lot of kind of backlash against it right now?
I mean, there's been off and on backlash for a while. So I don't remember if you remember between like 2012 and 2014, something called Gamergate,
Gamergate, yeah.
which was ridiculous. And it spun out of control. It was supposed to be about, ethics and game journalism, which it clearly never, ever was.
Mhm.
Right. That was just the excuse to basically be misogynistic and harass women in the industry. I only briefly got sideswiped, but I know a lot of coworkers and friends who got absolutely pummeled for trying to defend other women in the games industry. It was rough. And for a while, it's been getting better. I mean, I don't know why there is this objection to the fact that there are almost 50% of gamers are women, and it is demonstrable. And they don't all play Candy Crush or anything stereotypical. They are now playing, Call of Duty and Mass Effect and God of War. I'm a huge God of War fan. I have been since almost the beginning. So it's this need to recognize women, but we hadn't seen consistently female protagonists, or we haven't consistently seen characters from the queer community or people of different races. And now that the games industry has more and more developers who represent a larger scope of people, there's this backlash that it must be because they're forced to do so. And it's like, no, it's you told everyone in other communities, if you want a game where the protagonist that looks like you, go make that game. Now they're making that game, and now people are having a problem with it. It's like, hey, this is what you told people to do, and now it's happening, and it's great. It's more diverse stories, it's cooler characters and different worlds, and it's amazing. So I can't tell you why people kick and scream about it, but it's it's just it's happening. There's more diversity in games, and that's wonderful.
Yeah. And I mean, I think like Baldur's Gate is like a really good example of like a game that is like, that game is like maximalist in every way, but it is very inclusive. Did it win Game of the Year? I'm going to edit this out if I'm wrong, but
I believe it did. Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah. It won Game of the Year. And like that's, I think, evident to everything Meg was just saying about like the shift in the industry. And also to make a very loose thread is also, they're not like, I feel like sometimes like these reactionaries tend to frame it as like they're being censored or corrected, or like that political correctness is some kind of like restrictive thing. But we're in like, in many ways, like Baldur's Gate and Hades are very like, they're very kinky, sexy games in a lot of ways. Like there's an active choice to make everybody in these games like super sexual, but maybe not everyone.
Hades is hot in many different ways. You're not just in Tartarus, man. Everybody is hot there.
Yes.
And it's great because you can date Thanatos, you can date Meg, and you can do whatever, and it's never forced upon you.
Yeah.
In fact, there's one thing where Dusa is more of a friendship, and it runs the whole gambit that includes everyone, but it never feels forced. It feels very organic, which goes appreciated.
And I will say one improvement I liked with Hades 2 is that you did have really good diversity in the first game, but in terms of body diversity, that is a lot more present in this game so far with Hephaestus, Circe, with Hestia and things like that. So I appreciate that they started to do that a bit more. I was actually like cracking up a little bit because Hephaestus and Aphrodite at one point like were pairing up for a boon through a playthrough. And I'm like, they are way too friendly for that was not a good marriage in Greek mythology. Like maybe I have a little correction there. Like that is like canonically those two separated and Hephaestus remarried someone else. Like and then like cursed Aphrodite's daughter with a wedding gift. So like there's some bitterness there that exists. But
it was not a great breakup.
It was not. No, it was not good at all. So it was kind of it was funny, but like that's not problematic at the same time because it is true also that they were married to each other. Yeah. So, there's some fun there. And I do like, what's always really cool about Hephaestus as a character, and it's something that we often always see in media, is that he's a disabled god. Yeah. Which is always cool, right? That a deity reflects. Sorry, my cat's going a little bonkers over there.
Get up. Sorry. Be untamed.
To have a very visibly disabled god in the pantheon, and he's a very important one too of craftsmanship. And I think I was using an icebreaker on Blue Sky, be like, if Zeus just kicked the bucket and only one of his children could inherit, who do we think would win? I was being persuaded with the argument for Hephaestus because like he'd be underestimated, and he does some really cool traps for his family.
He does. And I also like that. Oh no, I was just going to quickly say I like that there is actual like evidence of you see Hephaestus sometimes in what looks like a wheelchair in actual ancient Greek art because he was quote unquote lame in one foot or one leg after he was thrown off of Olympus. And so I think that there's a book or a dissertation that I want to read all about like being disabled or having some sort of disability in ancient Greece and how that existed and how they dealt with it. And I'd love to read more about it because Hephaestus is a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's an article I just came across about this specifically at Epidavros where, and talking about like accessibility on the site.
Yeah. And Debbie Sneed does a lot of disability studies in the ancient world too. So like her work's
Yeah.
really, really cool
Yeah.
in that regard.
And sort of looking at it from like a universal perspective instead of a accommodation perspective of like everyone can go up a ramp, you know, but only like some people can go upstairs. And yeah, the idea that, yeah, you're just obviously a human and you need to function in a certain way in the world. So I kind of like that they had Aphrodite and Hephaestus as just being like a cozy little couple. It's like, yep, cool. We're just gonna go with this.
Yeah,
I didn't mind that.
because the Greeks might have viewed that as very ironic and incompatible, but to reimagine it as a compatible relationship, like the hottest of the goddesses with Hephaestus, who's an awesome guy who builds stuff. Like, do it. Why not?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Should we talk about boons and gods?
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton of characters we still haven't talked about either. So like wherever we want to go with it. I don't know. Was there any new characters that stood out to everyone? And then we could go into the boons of them if they have them.
Yeah.
I was going to say Medea and her curses, her nightly curses are interesting.
Okay, you're going to have to inform all of us because we have not run into Medea yet, which I'm very sad about. My golden retriever is named after Medea.
Oh, yes. It's fun. So full disclosure, I did a History and Games episode on Medea. So I had to, because I couldn't get past this one boss and I just haven't had time to go back and try to get rid of this boss. So like right after that boss, you run into Medea and she offers these boons called nightly curses. And basically they debuff enemies in different ways, I believe. And so it's really great because Medea's whole theme is, you know, being somebody who is known to, in the Argonautica and other sources, be a follower of Hecate and being able to do all these magical curses. That's what she's sort of known for, right? And so that's reflected. And they're always very roundabout with Medea's history because Melanoy really likes her, but when she talks about like family and friends, Medea gives her these very vague, kind of very ominous answers. And I love that. It's like, how do you handle Medea, right? The nightly curses, but you have to sort of know her backstory to really appreciate like what these curses do. And she's a necromancer in the game. And so that's part of her nightly curses. And it's very ominous and very interesting. How they handle her. And Circe as well, who is known to shapeshift and transform. So her boons do something unique to Circe as well. And of course, you have to know the Odyssey to sort of get those references. So subtle and very useful boons.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the characters that I keep going, it's like magical girl on a horse is beautiful, is Selene. And it's really interesting, like her presence too, of like surprisingly quite a few characters I came to realize when I looking at it, it's like they are considered titans. And there is this weird, I mean, the Titanomachy happened, right? There was the Titans versus the Olympians, and we're kind of bringing that up together. And I think that's why Hecate is an interesting character because according to Theoi.com, most of the female Titans actually either were neutral or they paired up with the Olympians. And they got to retain their powers, and a lot of them were prophetesses as a result. And I found that really interesting. The majority of the characters we're running into or interacting with are female titans and or witches that are in many ways descended from titans, which I thought was really cool. So I liked her. I don't understand how her boons work because Andy plays for me, but
I like that they call her Artemis and Melanoy the Silver Sisters, all the moon goddesses with moon aspects along with Hecate. I love that little nod too. Like I was like, oh man, these are really deep cuts. And Selene is so pretty.
She's so pretty.
She's so pretty.
She also works just really well with, I don't know, as Christy was saying, the entire kind of witchy theme. If we talk about, drawing down the moon, and the moon has so many feminine aspects, and I don't know, the fact that Celine comes in really early in this story makes a lot of sense. Again, it ties in really, really well just with the lore in general.
Yeah.
That's why I was kind of surprised. I don't know if you've met him yet, Meg, but like Icarus is apparently a character that you can come in contact with.
Yep.
Which you would think would be paired with Helios instead, but we don't have Helios currently as is.
Yeah. There's a lot, like there's still some characters that have like placeholder art. Another aspect, there's like placeholder art in places. We know this is maybe I don't know how much of a fraction of the game this is, because there's already a lot of game already.
Yeah.
Excuse me, in early access. Like I'm sure people, maybe you were just talking, people have spent tens of hours, dozens of hours on it easily, probably.
I did find out Narcissus does actually have artwork. I've seen a picture. He is not mid. We kept joking. It would be so funny because of the way Narcissus talks about himself. That is like, wouldn't it be funny if he was just like a normal looking character compared to all of these other gorgeous artwork characters? It's like, I don't want him to be ugly. I just want him to be mid. And like, it would just make it so much funnier.
I wonder for the artist, like when you're the artist that gets that assignment and you're like, oh shit, because you're like, I'm supposed to draw the most beautiful person ever. And I've already drawn like a dozen of the most beautiful people ever. Like, how do I like outdo myself? Like, where do I go? Like, because like, we're hitting an like there's an upper limit of hotness, right? That these characters are approaching. And like, how do you outdo it? But
yeah, when you make Death look really, really hot, right? And like Doom look really, really hot, like where do you go from there?
I was going to ask, where do you stand? Thanatos or Moros?
Oh no, don't make me choose.
I mean, this is probably a false dichotomy that I'm forcing upon our guest.
It's fair. I've got to give it to Thanatos, and I just love Thanatos and his dichotomy with Zagreus. One represents life. Like the cycle of life and, blood and life. And then one represents death. So I totally paired them because I just like their dichotomy. And I think Thanatos being so diligent and so dedicated to his mother, Nyx, because Nyx talks about, understandably, she has a tough relationship with some of her children, including Eris Strife, right? Whereas Thanatos is fiercely dedicated to the underworld. And you just have to love a hardworking, hot boy who cares deeply about his friends.
Oh, yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
But then again, Moros is very dedicated to his sisters, the Fates. So I don't know. It's so hard to choose.
Yeah.
Chrissy, how about you? I don't know if you have or Eli.
Between I feel like I still haven't seen enough of Moros yet to because he finally just started hanging out with us in the Crossroads. So I'm like, okay. And I like that the dynamic is he's super friendly for someone who portends doom all the time. And I do appreciate that. Like, no, I don't bring good news with me, but I don't have to be mean about it at the same time. Which I do appreciate.
He's incredibly polite, and which I respect.
Yeah. So, I feel like the interactions we've seen the most is Narcissus and Echo. And it's like, I really want to see where that goes exactly, especially because Echo's mechanic is so cool because all she can do is repeat the last thing she's heard, but they're still finding ways to communicate information through her. And we haven't played enough times to see how that connection might happen, like what happens with Orpheus and Eurydice in the first one, but I'm excited for that. I was kind of hoping that Penelope was going to be in the underworld because Odysseus is our contact, and maybe Penelope just ends up hanging out with Arachne or something.
I would put good money on Penelope making an appearance in this game in some way, shape, or form. If you have Achilles and Patroclus in Hades 1, it seems natural that.
Well, apparently Polyphemus is in the game.
That also could be fun.
Which we've not run into him yet.
If you'll indulge me in a brief tangent, Polyphemus is a character when I bring him up in my class and I'm like, you don't know it, but you're meeting the greatest tragic love character in all of ancient literature right here. This Cyclops who traps people in a cave and bashes their heads like puppies. This guy becomes fast forward a couple centuries, and this guy's going to become like a real, like the ancient equivalent of like a Hallmark, doomed love person. Like some of the best love elegy is coming from his mouth. I'll just, if readers, if you're curious, look into Theocritus and parts of Ovid, where Polyphemus waxes poetic about his love and why he maybe isn't such a bad match for people. But
Well, I will say the one quick look I got of his design is awesome as well, because he has the Nazar eye.
Really? That's
At
fun.
parts on his chest, but also I think they're mostly on his chest and then one on his forehead. So I liked how they incorporated the Greek evil eye into his design, which again is just the really smart play by Supergiant of not just taking literature mythology, but like so much of our mythology of ancient Greece is visual. Some of the earliest stuff is visual, including like the Trojan horse visually is depicted earlier than we have examples of the Homeric poems describing it, which is really cool to think about. And I think that becomes, part of the story. Am I correct in that? I feel like it.
No,
Like,
are you talking about the like geometric period where like that you see these horses and
I think
like-
there's some earlier Bronze Age stuff
even
of
even
the Trojan
earlier?
horse. I think so.
Oh.
I could be
Because it gets
wrong.
a shout out in the Odyssey for sure, but
It's referenced in the Odyssey.
dating that is a whole other.
Is a whole
That's a whole thing.
I'm saying the written down version just to like, so I'm saying 7th, 8th century BCE for the written down version of the epic poetry, not necessarily when the oral history originated. The visuals are older than the written down, supposedly.
Right, because
Yeah.
it can't
But-
be
and also-
earlier than the Phoenician alphabet, right? Because there's that Bronze Age cutoff. So then you have the Phoenician alphabet. So if we're talking about Homeric poetry, it'd have to be what, 8th century?
Something like
that's generally
yeah, probably.
too, yeah.
But even like, so in the, like, it blends, like Chris, you're saying, like kind of different, not just like all of Greek sort of visual iconography, but different visual iconographies, like plural, where like in the first game, you get it with the weapons a little bit, where like different aspects of the weapons originally, they're like different characters from myth, but then the final stage is some non-Greek thing. Like we get a shout out to like Chinese myth and Arthurian and Beowulf and Gilgamesh and all this stuff. And then like with the witchy theme, like, the pentagrams, the witch aesthetics, the wide brim hat, like none of that is ancient Greek, but like it's fine. It's okay. It's visual shorthand for us, the audience, to like kind of like to help us along. And like we're integrating, like, which is in many ways it's a very actually Homeric thing to do, that you're having kind of anachronistic synthesis. Like we're having the story and we have elements from the past and elements from the present, and we're kind of merging them together to create the story and create a visual language that sort of translates to our audience. Wow.
Yeah, because what another one is when you get to Scylla, who I love. I love the songs, all the songs she sings as you fight her. Andy hates it. I love it.
It's so funny.
Her performers is it Rocky and Jetty or something like that? It's
It's so good.
which is a reference to Joan Jett and oh shoot, Cherry Bomb.
The Runaways.
The Runaways, yeah.
That is no.
Is it
that not
Roxy?
Joan Jett?
Now I'm thinking Chicago too.
See, I didn't even notice. I didn't even pay attention to that. Now there's just a whole nother layer that I have to go back and be like, oh my God, I totally missed the names of the sirens.
And then also like as you fight, if you take out her bassist or drummer, it removes it from the music. So she will sing a cappella at some point. Like it's just so cool. I love that.
That was one of my favorite fights to actually watch happen. Just because there was so much going on and it was so distracting. And it almost didn't feel like a fight. It was just like, we're just dancing around. We also might die. I don't know. It's fun. It's great.
So I know we can definitely talk about more boons and stuff, but I'm all here for theorizing as well, because a big question is what happened? Why we Hades is chained in Tartarus. We do see that. as far as I know, I haven't seen Zagreus or Nyx at all. Don't know what happened to them or Persephone. And how did Kronos get free in order to mint new coin and and redecorate Hades'
Mhm.
home?
Put on his own aesthetic.
Hmm. Which is very Egyptian like at the just wanted to point that out. So what have been your guys' thoughts on that so far? We don't usually theorize, so
I mean, I had to be careful because I know what happens in the story, so
You can spoil,
you
like,
can
we can
spoil,
say,
yeah,
like,
okay.
we're a spoiler heavy kind of place.
Okay, I always wanna be careful though. It's a true story. So the big twist in Final Fantasy VII was spoiled for me back in 1997, 2 hours before I got to that event, and I'm bitter to this day, so I'm
that
always careful
that
with
Eris lives and has a
spoilers.
long and happy life. As we all know, she
Yes,
goes and
clearly,
she's on a
right?
fa
But, oh
yeah,
my
she's on
god,
a farm in upstate New York.
that's one of those tragic, "Where were you that day?" And I remember
Mhm.
exactly when my best friend spoiled it for me. I was sitting on the
Oh,
stairs of
man.
my parents' house, and she just blurted it out, and I was furious.
I'm impressed she
8-year-old
knew.
Colin. Yeah, I'm gonna go back into this list of movies we're making, and I should just add the cutscene where Sephiroth stabs Aerith in the chest.
That's not a film.
But a
I mean, it's
formative moment for
cinematic.
It is
yeah.
dramatic for sure.
That was like I was like, "You can do that? You can kill a main character? That's allowed?" Like,
Yeah, that was
um
such a mind blowing because up until then with Final Fantasy, it was always like major side characters,
Mhm.
but never
mhm,
before like, "Oh no, you can't kill the main heroine. You can't do that." I mean, it
mhm,
was such a shock. So yeah, definitely.
mhm,
But but again, I want to be very careful. But there is a reason why like Kronos it's connected to the fates and sort of figuring out like how to get out and how to rule. I can't exactly remember the details, but that's sort of how he's able to. You actually see a cut scene of the moment Kronos gets out and everyone tries to stop him, but of course, as the god of time, he can stop them in
Mhm.
their tracks. But because Melanoy and others were not there, they actually managed to escape and go into this liminal space, the crossroads, which is a space between spaces, and that's how they all managed to get safe, which is really cool. Again, it goes into the idea of, well, how would you escape? Well, if you're in a
Mhm.
space between spaces, then Kronos can't find you. You're not in Hades, but you're not on Olympus or Earth. Where are you? So it ties into the idea of Hecate being the protector of spaces, and the reason she is so protective and wants to do well is because in the Homeric hymns
mhm,
is a handmaiden to both Demeter and Persephone. She guides Persephone to and from the underworld. So this is her job, is to protect Persephone and her family. So it kind of explains like why she's so dedicated to this cause. It's very
mhm.
personal for her.
Mhm.
Yeah. And there's shout outs a little bit also too on the idea of like figures and deities that move between spaces where Hermes is the one who like brings news that like this is happening and that like he was the kind of whistleblower, for lack of a better word, that like everything was going down. And I think like as you play through the game, there's some shout outs where like some of the gods have like a closer association with the underworld than others, or like have a little bit more of that like permeability, and like Hermes being one where he's got some kind of relationship with Charon and Artemis, I think to a lesser extent, and other gods who kind of like some like Zeus stays up on high and like stays up in his chamber, and Hades similarly like stays down low and they kind of maintain the poles. But then there's the others that move between and around and through and things like that.
Yeah, and there's also Chaos, who is also
Mhm,
important to the story and how Kronos managed to get out, right? Like Chaos is also a part of it. In the first game, his boons always come with a catch, right? Like you'll get this
mhm,
first, but first you have to suffer through some sort of debuff, which I love that it's interesting, and I love that Chaos is ambiguous because Chaos
yeah.
is literally ambiguous. So that's
Mhm.
Mhm,
another really cool thing. And I love Chaos's new design. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's it's
I
really
mhm.
saw a
cool.
quick little picture of it. I'm like, "Oh, chaos is back. Okay." We haven't
Yeah.
gotten that far yet, but
Okay. I don't wanna spoil too much, but I love the design for Chaos in Hades too. It's just a trip.
nice. I will say, like, so based on what I was seeing, and I was going back to like what the Titanomachy was and who the Titans were in terms of creating the world as we know it, according to like the mythology. And the Titans are usually they are the ones credited with putting the world in order, especially in terms of like astronomical order as well. And so my thought was, well, the results of the first game, Zagreus kind of upends order. And as a result, that presents an opportunity for Kronos and other Titans to come back and be like, oh, you messed up. We got to come back and put things back in order. But is that order necessarily? I mean, that's what's really interesting. Hesiod talks about, the 5 ages of man, humankind. Is it all man or is it just the age of man? I don't know.
And it's usually how it gets rendered is just
Yeah.
like ages of man or mankind or something like that. But
Yeah. And the funny thing is Hesiod says, everything comes from chaos, and then you have the golden age, and that was ruled by Kronos.
Mhm.
And then
I guess-
eras got progressively worse with the Olympians.
Yeah. I'm reading through Georgix right now, which is the whole thing where like the Iron Age is closely associated with Jupiter / Zeus is like the one who imposes. But I'm going to leave that all to the side because at first, I guess we probably should address the elephant in the room with Kronos, which is my first I had a kind of reaction, which is the conflation of Kronos with a CH and then Kronos, I guess, like with a K or just a C or something like that, that like the god, so the Titan Kronos, father of Zeus, deposed by Zeus, rules over a golden age, has a sickle, cut off his dad's junk, threw into the sea,
etc. Yes,
all the stuff, right? He's a thing, and then also in Greek, Kronos with kind of a ch or an aspirated kappa or whatever we want to call it, or a chi rather, is just time personified and doesn't really show up in a whole lot of myths. And this is where I kind of came around on it, with the big exception of Orphism and Orphic hymns, where Kronos with the ch, time personified, becomes a pretty big element there. So I don't know what your thoughts, because like that for me, that's like something that often I've seen it before, like it's come up in other tellings of the association with the two Kronoses. Like it goes all the way back to the Renaissance, I guess. But I don't know. What did you all think about this kind of conflation of time and Kronos?
That was kind of the point you brought up with Chaos too, right? The Netflix series that chose to spell chaos with the K instead of a CH. As if we are playing with these ideas of like, actually, you need to know those fine details between the different spellings and what those different spellings might actually personify. Because it might give something away to the story itself. I guess my question is too, is like they do present him as very Egyptian, or you could even say like, very early archaic style of representation.
There's a reference to him getting, spoilers a little bit, to him getting torn apart and reassembled, which is why in the character design you see he's got these
interesting,
like fuse lines basically
that
where
are
he's
gold,
been like,
I think we had talked about, I forget what that is in the. Is it
like the Japanese art style, where you like refuse broken pottery with gold.
Yeah, but I mean, that's also an Egyptian story, right? It's
Osiris getting
Osiris gets taken apart and pulled everywhere. That's kind of interesting.
And so does Orpheus, right?
Yes.
Well,
but
Orpheus
he doesn't get put back together.
He doesn't get put back
does get ripped apart.
The Dionysus Zagreus thing is that Dionysus gets ripped apart and then reassembled by the gods.
Right. I kind of didn't mind the Kronos conflation. I think it kind of works as this like, I don't know, cyclical, the old school
emphasis on sickle.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I think it kind of works as like the old timer, almost like the boomer, coming back around, and like everybody's like, there's time is still a part of everything. It made some sense to me.
I think there's a through line between, if you think about it, right? Like Chronos as opposed to Kronos. And I don't know if I'm quite pronouncing that right because I don't speak fluent Greek, but the idea of an agricultural god with a sickle and then a god of time. Well, time was people kept time through agricultural seasons, right? Like celestial bodies doing something during certain times of the year, which indicated it was summer or spring. It was time to sow. It was time to reap. So it's interesting that they could be conflated. And I don't know if it has anything to do with like the medieval image of like father time with a sickle, right? Like that's the symbol of the sickle, right? Like obviously they've been conflated since at least medieval time and earlier. somebody mentioned like the idea of even in the archaic period, this may have been a bit of a conflation, but it doesn't bother me too much just because we're arguing the semantics of you have the personification of time, but then agriculture, the personification of agriculture, I can say it, both are just the idea of space and time, the passing of time. So they're different, and yet the conflation doesn't bother me too much because ultimately people look to the earth and the sky to keep time, to know when it's time to sow, reap, harvest, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have to kind of remember that our sense of time is very, I want to say digital, but it's like more like the analog time. It's like it's very much set up by numbers, even though it is still based on celestial and solar and earth movement.
Yeah,
overall.
I mean, in his character design, like speaking of like anachronisms and kind of synthesizing, like his collar is like a clock. It's got Roman numerals around it.
Awesome.
That's like he's like wearing a clock. But I mean, ultimately, I also came around to it because like also I decided like one of the things about this game is like all of the characters are very like strongly themed. That's like an aspect of the game. Everybody's like got a theme, and one of the problems with Kronos with a K is that he's hard to thematize. Like he is an agricultural god, or in Rome at least he very much is, but he doesn't really have he's not as like strongly themed. And so like the time thing is like a little bit more something you can kind of sink your hooks into. As you play, there's lots of time puns and running out of time and what about time and stop time. There's like lots of wordplay and punning. And again, the broader theme of time as like an idea and a mechanic to work with in the game. And so for that reason, because I don't think this is a case of like, I think in a game where they're referencing Orphic hymns, like ignorance is probably not the problem. It's a deliberate choice. And when that's happening,
Absolutely.
I'm like, great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder if there's intentionality of making him appear anachronistic as well, like with the Roman numerals, because one thing that I noticed is that when we speak to him, his voice does a thing where it sounds present, but then it drops to a lower register and it gets more echoey, as like how you might imagine someone who is possessed, how they would modulate someone's voice in that way. But it made me wonder if like his personification is speaking from different periods of time, but in this moment altogether.
Yeah, that he like lives in all time simultaneously.
Yeah. That's a really cool observation that, like his voice does change depending on the circumstance. And it's like, is he getting further away as if he's talking either from the future or further from the past? So that's a really cool, I wouldn't put it past Supergiant Games to do that.
Yeah. It was something, because I think Chaos had a really cool voice effect too in the first game when we heard it. So like I kind of clocked it.
It's like a man and a woman speaking simultaneously, I think, with Chaos.
Which is awesome.
Which is a cool nod to the Orphic belief of this being not any particular gender, and like it's really cool.
Yeah, there's like a primordial egg that contains all genders, and then it like births a couple of like light and time and a couple of other things. It gets very strange, and at some point it feels like when you're reading Orphic literature, it's like, am I at Burning Man? Like,
it's wild.
When you're talking about anytime cosmic eggs come up, but sorry, yes,
cosmic eggs are great. No, I have kind of a question that it might feel kind of wrap uppy, but we can sort of see.
Yeah, and we're at an hour, Meg. Also, just to make sure that we're being conscientious of everyone's time, pun intended.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Well, I was just my other question is like, so we do have the story of the Titans, of this sense of time and mission to overthrow Kronos. Do you guys have any further thoughts on why there's such an emphasis on the Odyssey and maybe Nostos as kind of a secondary theme being brought up with a lot of the characters? As opposed to the first one, you might argue is more like, I don't even know if the Trojan War really was. It just seemed more like all the heroes, because you had Theseus, you had Achilles, you had Patroclus.
I mean, so in one sense, like part of a thing about the sequel and like sequels broadly is it needs to be familiar but different, like the same but different. And there's certain echoes and parallel, like an echo So, but like you have kind of parallel characters, like Moros in this game, it feels like somewhat analogous to Thanatos in the first game. And in that sense, Odysseus is analogous to Achilles, like the way he works, that he hangs out in your camp, dispenses advice, is some kind of, in this game, he's kind of like your strategist. He's like your tactician, whereas Achilles was like your coach. And that there are these sort of parallels, but then the parallels are also either sort of inverted or reversed in some ways, where like in many ways Odysseus is like he's very different from Achilles, where Achilles is like all id, or he's all, it's all emotion, it's all heart on sleeve, everything is up front, speaks what he's thinking, a person of action. And Odysseus is the opposite. He's dissembling, he's duplicitous, he's scheming, he's thinking through plots. And so in that sense, it just feels like a logical next step of like who's going to be the kind of Achilles figure in the underworld. Like Odysseus is a very natural sort of jump over. And then you can kind of work from that with, like you're saying, Christy, like ideas of like homecoming and return. Because also you have this theme with Melinoe. She has lived in this liminal space, but she never really was in the house of Hades with her family, with Hades and Persephone and Zagreus and things like that. And like that's what she's fighting for, to get back to. And then again, that's like another thematic sort of thing to sink your claws into, and then why to bring Odysseus in as opposed to like any other character.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's a great observation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that also makes sense because of it. Like when she is presented with the option to go to Olympus and help the Olympians, all of a sudden she's kind of like, should I do that? Because both of these places are places we think of as home to the gods, one to the chthonic gods, one to the Uranus
Olympian,
god,
yeah.
the
rest of
sky
them.
Yeah,
gods.
or Uranians. Well,
Yeah.
no, the Uranians, that's a different thing. But
And you realize that she has in fact been in this liminal space, this in between, for so long that now she does have to decide what and define what is home at that point.
And to the character art, she's got one regular hand and she's got one skelly hand. But that she is and she's got one green eye, one red eye. Like I think that another theme they're going with Melinoe is she's sort of split down the middle in some way. And like there's two halves pulling in two different directions. I wonder, even if we're making predictions, if there's going to be a thing towards the late game of like a character choice. Like, do you go down? Do you go up?
Yeah. I love all these interpretations. They're so good because it's so Supergiant Games to have multiple themes. Because I love the idea of the homecoming, right? And Melinoe being split in terms of her decisions. But it's also, there's a couple of really smart references to like the, Orphic hymn to Melinoe is about that she's double-bodied, right? She's double-bodied and she represents both the upper air and the lower air because of chthonic Zeus, the chthonic version of Zeus, and of course, her mother Persephone, who is also of the upper and lower air. And also, I was thinking about like Odysseus, right? And I'm going to butcher this word because I'm tired and I can't remember the exact word, but Catabasis, like the going down. Odysseus goes to the underworld, right? Like, so Odysseus is perfect for being there because he knows the underworld. He's one of the few people who have, had that experience of talking to ghosts and going through that. And, spoiler alert, Hercules, awesome.
Heracles is there.
In Hades too, right? It's the idea of people who are connected to the underworld. And with Achilles, not only is he underworld, but at the end of the Iliad, who does he see? Who chides him? It's Patroclus, right? Like telling him, I need a proper burial and I'm very unhappy and da-da-da. So there's this really heavy theme of the afterlife with both Achilles and Odysseus. But Odysseus has actually sort of been in that liminal space of the underworld where he talks to, Agamemnon, he talks to Achilles, who's a lot less, cynical about the underworld.
A different tune.
It's like two different themes here going on, right? So I think that underworld aspect of but being deeper than just we're copy pasting history. It's that idea of a homecoming and what does home mean to Melinoe? Because what would it mean to her? She's never known these people. So I just love these different layers that you have to unpeel. It's great.
He's Odysseus that you just reminded me. Odysseus, he is like Achilles in many ways, or he's like connected or attached or a shoot off, but also Orpheus, who's in the first game, as like one of the people who goes down into the underworld and as a living person has been there, that he is Orphic in some ways. But yeah.
I so want to run into Heracles now. I'm just imagining he's like wandering around. It's like, I got to find this damn dog again.
I'm going to peek. I want to look up I'm curious what his character art is.
Do look it up. It's really neat. Also, I just wanted to give a shout out to Theseus in the first Hades. He is so insufferable. It's great.
Oh, he is my favorite character from that first game, and not because I like favorite character in this, I like him, but I think he's the best realized character of like this. Like in today, his name would be Lachlan if he was alive today or something, and he would be on the lacrosse team. And he would get a full ride to Dartmouth and think that he earned it. But apologies to any Lachlans on the Dartmouth lacrosse team that I kind of tangentially insulted. But
shots fired.
Truly.
I just love that Zagreus just constantly rags on him too. Like in the first game, he's just constantly talking about Ariadne and everything. And it's just like, you suck. He gets so mad.
You suck.
Which actually, I think maybe my actual favorite character in that first game is Asterion, who's just, and then at a certain point, you're like, why are you with this guy? And Asterion's like, I owe him big. and Asterion's a real mensch.
True. All right. Are we feeling?
I think we cut you off. Yeah.
No, mine was, I said it wanted to be wrap up-y, so I just wanted to make sure that we hit.
Yeah. Any other final points or shout outs that people want to do on the game we've seen so far? I imagine we'll have to revisit again in the future just because it's still in development. There's still a lot of interesting things that they can do here. And so far, good job, Supergiant. You're killing it as far as I can tell.
Seriously, I predicted they would do a sequel and everyone shouted me down. Supergiant Games doesn't do sequels. And like, they will for this one. They absolutely will.
Yeah. So, like, do you know how capitalism works? But
right?
They only had like 3 games before this, so whatever. All right. Oh yeah. Sorry. Any final points? Anything that anyone wants to also get? I know. Never mind. I'm losing the thread. Because Chrissy just asked that.
I did. It's okay. Oh, I guess the one other character I'm interested about is Dora, which we imagine as being a play on Pandora. And I don't know if any of us have played enough to like get a sense if that's like who she is, because canonically she's technically the first mortal woman, right?
Yeah.
And all I get with her interaction so far is like she tries to come off very evil, and she does have like a different appearance when she's trying to like be scary, but otherwise she's just kind of like nonchalant, and it's very different than Dusa, which was a kind of fun because you knew that was supposed to be a reference to Medusa, and the characterization was so different than I think what we imagine of a monstrous Medusa character. And I just don't know if like Pandora is kind of more white bread in terms of a character. It's like, nope, she opened a box and bad things happened, and that's about all we know about.
Yeah, she comes across as a indifferent, like snarky teenager. But I haven't played the most recent updates. I don't know if they updated this, but they kind of hinted that Dora had been there for a very, very long time, which I thought was interesting. And so it's still a little mysterious to me, but I'm like, who else could it be but Pandora, right? But she can't remember anything. So
does that like her name would because Pandora means all gifted, so just Dora would just be gifted?
That would just
gifts.
It's just a word for gift. It's just gifts, but that's not
okay. Fair enough. Reading too much into it. I'm sure they're gonna do something. Maybe like that's the weak link for me so far. Is like I'm really curious to see what they'll do with her. She feels like the weak link so far, but
maybe it's just a thread that they're putting in really, really early.
Yeah. Because I mean, if she has been there like for a really long time, maybe she is one of the first shades to appear in the underworld because she is the first mortal woman. And that makes sense because Prometheus is also in the underworld.
There you go.
Yep.
So I could see that. Technically, it was his brother who married her, but still, that could be a fun reunion
But
too.
still.
Close
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah, family dynamics in this mythology. You gotta love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
All
Okay.
right.
Okay. Here's my wrap up thought or question. I know that there's so much left of this sequel, but in the opportunity that there could be a trilogy, a third edition, who do you guys think and / who do you want to like, what is that deep cut that could be a really fun addition to a Hades world?
That's tough because they've covered major aspects of the Orphic hymns, and I'm thinking, who else is left in the Orphic hymns, the Orphic tradition, or any other late antiquity
Phonies
cults?
and
Yeah.
yeah.
See, I almost want to go in the opposite direction. It's like, who do I see on Mount Olympus who wants to get the hell out? And
Ooh, interesting. Okay.
and I am like leaning towards like maybe Ganymede or
It's funny you said that because my first thought actually was Hebe, who
yeah,
is also
that was the other
Zeus's
person I was
cupbearer,
thinking. Hebe.
Okay.
the goddess of youth. But I don't know.
So it's also an escape story.
Yeah, just going
In
the
a-
opposite way.
Just go in the opposite
Like,
direction.
that's why I think Ganymede could be interesting because if by being abducted by Zeus and being made a cupbearer to Zeus on Mount Olympus, all he actually wants to do is escape by dying, but maybe he has
Interesting.
immortality, so he has to figure out how to do that.
How to unimmortalize himself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anti-apotheosis, however you do that.
Yeah,
How do you
it's
kill
literally
God?
the opposite of apotheosis.
death. I seek death.
Death.
Yeah, I think, like, I don't know if you can still call it Hades at that point, but, like, the goal is to go meet Hades. Maybe
get
his goal is to go meet Hades. It's like, "Can you please make this happen? Your brother did a thing, and I do not appreciate."
I have a thought now, but I'm gonna wait a second.
Okay.
But
That's mine. That's my pitch.
I'd have to think about it because that's a really good pitch. I'm like, I like that. The idea of how do I get off of, because we've already been in different parts of Tartarus. How do we get out of Olympus?
my thought where I was going was actually to go back to Persephone, not back necessarily, but something where something is happening to her children, Melanoi and Zagreus, and Persephone has to intervene. And then Persephone becomes our main protagonist.
Interesting.
Although I'm not sure if that necessarily is like cohesive with what we've seen of her so far and things like that.
Sure.
But that was my thought.
You could play with time too. Like maybe you get a little bit of her original abduction. So like
I don't
maybe
know. I'm wary of prequels.
That's
the last 20 years of movies have taught me of like,
That's fair.
I'm like, to that end, I'm like, is there anything we could learn in a prequel about Persephone that we don't already know from the first game? But like something that like Persephone takes up the mantle to save her family. That's sort of my thought. If we go with Hades 3, which they may not.
Well, yeah, I know that like there very likely might not ever be a Hades 3, but it was so interesting seeing like the shift from Zagreus to Melanoi. And so I've always been thinking like, how else would we live in this world? What other journeys could we make?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, the whole Egyptian side of things got me thinking more on like the Isis journey, or maybe some sort of transformation. We have to get out of it. Almost like Apuleius, like we're doing a golden ass.
The golden ass would be an amazing game to where it's like you're just a donkey and you're just trying to de-donkeyfy yourself.
Exactly.
The only other thing I could imagine in terms of a journey would be like the edge of the world, like an Alexander before Alexander sort of things of like, oh, right, mythology tells us these are the ends of the world. How do we actually go to those spaces and get there? But I don't know who you would have be your protagonist for that journey.
The original game was like the concept for the original game was Theseus, and it was Theseus in the labyrinth. And then that shifted over time and and then Theseus became the villain. And I think all of the choices were for the better. Zagreus and everything about Hades is better, I think, than that initial pitch. But Meg, any thoughts?
You know, I'm trying to rack my brain. So all the Chthonic gods, the Olympians, and I'm like, they've told this story so well because what's underpinning it all is the Orphic hymns, right? Like,
Yeah.
but it goes
Yeah.
like, a roguelite perfect for, you die, you're born again, die, you're born again. Like, it was just such a really brilliant thing. And I can't really think of how to continue that cycle, although the idea of like an immortal trying to be mortal, almost like a Prometheus trying to get out of pain thing. So I think
Yeah.
that's the only sort of option that's left, is having an Olympian who maybe doesn't want to be there or has a disagreement with the Olympian. Trying to rack my brain for one of the gods, or their children, escaping Olympus. And I think that's the best way to go about it. But
Sure.
yeah.
No, I agree that what they have now works so well, and that maybe this is one of those cases where a third installment would just detract from everything. But I was curious.
Well, at the end of the day, it's like, I hope this game to me feels like the most fleshed out thing of mythology I've seen in a long time, that,
Oh yeah.
was so popular during COVID. I'm not sure, like, I feel like the sequel definitely lives up to the first game of just what we've seen so far, so that when it does release, I hope that it's just as popular. I hope it doesn't fall into the pitfalls of a very female slash witch cast, which is all a bunch of badasses and really cool. I hope there isn't some weird, stupid backlash against that, because I mean, 2024 was a lot of things, but it was also the year of the witch, because you got Agatha Harkness
Mhm.
series that was a lot of fun.
Yep.
You
I was
got
about to ask if you had
Wicked, you
if
got,
you'd seen that. Mhm.
got Hades. It's like it was the year of the witch, if nothing else.
All right. Should I take us out?
Let's do it.
All right. Special thanks again to Meg of History and Games for joining us this evening to discuss Hades 2 and Archeo Gaming. Meg, if our listeners want to hear or see or check out more from you, where should they go?
So you can go to my YouTube channel, which is just History and Apostrophe Games. I also have an audio version of my podcast on all audio platforms. And the best way to reach me on social media is through Blue Sky. And I am, let me get on my reading glasses because I'm at that age, of Celtic Queen Meg.bsky.social. And don't be shy about reaching out to me with questions, comments, suggestions, all that good stuff. I love interacting with people and talking about history and video games.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We hope you had a good time and enjoyed our meanderings.
I
through the underworld.
loved it. This was so much fun. I love talking to people who know their history and know their mythology. It's so much fun.
Excellent.
Always.
We love
Yeah.
people who know their gaming when we don't.
Finally, special thanks to all you listeners. We could not produce episodes like this without your support. That said, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe if you like what you hear. You can find all of our episodes on movieswedig.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about our upcoming plans and episode release, please be sure to follow us on social media, where you can find us under the handle of some variation of movies_we_dig or something like that, or @digmovies. We will talk again soon. Bye.
Bye.